There's this hidden power struggle shaping just about everything you buy, from your food all the way to your car. It's this huge global tug of war between giant multinational corporations and the very countries they operate in. And today, we're going to pull back the curtain on this whole conflict.
Food security is national security. Now, when you hear national security, what comes to mind? Probably armies, right? Spy agencies. But you know what triggered this powerful statement? It wasn't a military threat. Nope. It was a business deal. And it was all about pork.
That's right. The quote was a response to the massive $4.7 billion sale of the American pork giant Smithfield Foods to a Chinese company back in 2013. And man, did that deal ignite a political firestorm. It really tapped into this deep-seated fear we all kind of have. Who controls our nation's resources? So that whole Smithfield controversy, it's the perfect way to understand what we're talking about in this explainer. It brings to light this invisible conflict, this tug of war, right? Between these huge global companies with borderless ambitions and the governments that have very specific, bordered responsibilities to their own people.
Okay, so let's get into it. What does this core conflict actually look like? Well, it really just boils down to two totally different ways of seeing the world.
All right, here's the problem in a nutshell. You've got these multinational corporations, MNCs, right? Their entire reason for being is to maximize profit across the entire globe. They're chasing efficiency, new markets, wherever they can find them. But then you have governments, and they have to answer to their citizens locally. Their focus is completely different. It's about jobs, taxes, and security right there at home. And that fundamental disconnect, that's where all the tension comes from.
So, with that kind of built-in tension, it's really no surprise that governments have come up with their own playbooks to try and rein in these corporate giants. Let's take a look at how they've tried to do that over the years.
You have to remember, back in the mid-20th century, a lot of nations were newly independent. For them, the memory of colonialism was still incredibly fresh. So when they saw these big foreign companies moving in, they didn't just see business. They saw symbols of the same old foreign economic dominance. And they were absolutely determined to assert their own control.
And the response? It was basically to build a whole toolkit for control. And we're not talking about subtle influence here. This was pretty much brute force. Governments would just straight up nationalize industries, just take them over. They'd force companies to sell a majority stake to local people. They put caps on how much profit could be sent home. They even demanded that companies use local suppliers. The goal was crystal clear: make these global giants serve the country's own development goals.
And look, don't think this was some rare, extreme thing that only happened a couple of times. The data is pretty clear. These government takeovers of foreign companies, especially in things like natural resources and utilities, they absolutely skyrocketed, hitting their peak right around the mid-1970s. Okay, so what was happening in the developed world at the same time? Well, they had a pretty different approach. They were generally way more open to foreign investment. But they still drew some lines in the sand. They typically block foreign ownership in sectors they considered critical. Things like defense, airlines, maybe even media and broadcasting. So what this all comes down to, really, is a constant bargaining game. A push and pull over power and money. But the big question is, who really holds the cards? Well, in some situations, you get this really fascinating dynamic called the obsolescing bargain. Just imagine a big multinational company coming in to build a giant mine. At the very beginning, the company has all the power, right? They've got the cash, the tech. But what happens once that billion-dollar mine is built? It's stuck there. It's basically a fixed hostage. You can't just pick it up and move it. So over time, as the local workforce gets trained up, the power starts to shift dramatically back to the host country. And then they can start demanding a much better deal. But that model doesn't work for everything. Think about a manufacturing plant instead of a mine. The money is way more mobile, and the technology is changing all the time. A car factory isn't a hostage in the same way a copper mine is. And that gives a corporation the advantage in the long run, which in turn forces countries and even states within countries to compete like crazy to get those factories to come to them. And this crazy competition has sparked a race to offer what are called locational incentives. That's really just a fancy way of saying that governments are throwing massive packages of cash, tax breaks, you name it, all these goodies to try and lure in those big investments.
Just how massive are we talking?
Well, back in 1992, the state of South Carolina offered BMW a package worth $135 million. Think about that. That works out to about $67,500 for every single job that was created.
But it didn't stop there. Just a few years after that, Alabama basically said, hold my beer, and put together a package worth around $250 million to get a Mercedes-Benz plant. And when you break that down on a per-job basis, the cost was just staggering. We're talking up to $250,000 for each job that factory was promising. That's what it costs to play in this global game.
So, with the stakes being this incredibly high, you'd think there'd be some kind of global rule book, right? Some kind of referee. But the search for one, well, it's been pretty much a story of one failure after another.
I mean, for decades, the world has tried to get a single set of rules on the books. There was an attempt with a trade organization back in the 40s, then a UN code of conduct in the 70s, a big global investment agreement in the 90s, and every single one of them failed. And it always fails for the same reason. The wealthy countries want rules that protect their companies when they go abroad, but the developing countries want rules that help them control those companies. It's a fundamental deadlock.
So, what happens when you can't get one global agreement? You end up with what we have now, this chaotic, kind of tangled web of thousands and thousands of separate individual agreements.
And this whole system is built on what are called bilateral investment treaties, or BITs for short. They're basically just one-on-one deals between two countries that lay out the terms for investment. And like I said, there are over 2,300 of these things in force today, creating this incredibly complex global web of rules.
Now, the big critique of this whole system is that it's lopsided. It's asymmetric. The treaties are often written in a way that favors the powerful capital exporting countries. And get this, they often include rules that give corporations an incredible amount of power, the power to actually sue an entire government in a special international tribunal. Let's say a country passes a new environmental law that hurts the company's profits. They can sue. You can see how that dramatically tilts the scales of power.
So where does that leave us? What does all this actually mean? Well, this fierce global competition for investment, it can lead to something that people call the race to the bottom. And that leaves us with a really important final question to think about. When governments get locked into these bidding wars, when they start offering massive tax breaks and maybe weakening environmental or labor rules just to land that next big factory, who is it that really pays the price? I mean, who foots the bill for all those incentives, and who has to live with the consequences? Figuring that out, that's the real challenge at the heart of this global tug of war.